Hi there. I'm going to be making some changes on this channel. I've been wanting to have a story segment on the channel because I believe that every place has a story. In this story, this one is special to me. It's unpublished. My late father wrote it, and I adapted it for audio and did some of the other work. Going forward, I'm going to include Northern California places as backroads to Oregon because I live on the California border at the headwaters of the Klamath. And to me, those places downstream are backroads. And I have roots there. I have ancestry there, especially at the mouth of the river where the Yurok live. In this story, all of the places are real. The names and addresses of houses and establishments have been changed. As for the people, only the names have been changed to protect the guilty. The Intruders of the Sacred Waters. It was a Friday afternoon. As I was walking back from the college, I still had no plan for the weekend, and next week was Easter week, meaning I had a good long 9 days off with no commitments and no real plans. At the door to my apartment on F Street, I gathered up the mail and went in to where my roommate Ted had preceded me by several minutes. "Hey, Ted, what did you think of that hydraulics test?" Ted was in the kitchen opening a beer.
It was fine. Mr. Moore asked all the questions he said were going to be on the exam, so for once I was fully ready for it.
I had opened a letter from my mother and scanned it quickly while Ted was developing further comments on the test and our professor, Ted. My mother asked me how I liked the cookies she mailed me last week. To my knowledge, they never arrived. Do you know anything about them?
Well, sure. We got them. Peanut butter and chocolate chips. The package was slightly damaged from the postal service, but otherwise everything was fine.
You know, I'm happy that you enjoyed them. You should probably write my mother and tell her how good they were. Are there any of those cookies left? And if so, where are they? And why am I just now learning about them?
There are lots left, and they are right up here in this top shelf where they are safe. I don't know why you don't look through the cupboards for food. You make it sound like it is my duty to feed you or something.
So I climbed on top of the counter. From there, I could reach the top cupboard. I opened the door and discovered that the cookies were there, but probably 2/3 of the cookies were gone. Ted was not easily embarrassed, but there was a bit of red in his cheeks. He was quick-witted and not prone to ever admit he had done anything wrong.
I've been thinking about going to the keg for a pizza and beer, and you're more than welcome to come along and help me eat it.
Nothing cheap or tight-fisted about him. He was just the share and share alike guy, especially with my stuff. So we walked the 2 blocks to the keg, our favorite hangout, ordered some draft beers and a pizza, and got started on the weekend. Ted paid for the pizza, but he was just a few dollars short, so I chipped in. The live music started on Friday evenings about 7 p.m., so naturally we stayed to greet a few friends, down a few more beers, and dance to rock and roll tunes with a few of the girls. My steady girlfriend Shirley was on her way home to Crescent City for the week-long spring break, but we had lots of friends and acquaintances here in Arcata, so the evening moved along fine. About midnight, Ted came over to my table.
I've been thinking, I have this week off from the meatpacking plant. What's your schedule?
My boss at State Parks has taken a week off and is camping with his wife and children down below Benbow Park, so I'm also off.
Fishing season opens tomorrow morning. I know a spot over by Willow Creek where we might have some luck. Why don't we go home, get our gear, and take off?
Ted drove his old Volvo PV 544 for a little over an hour on that twisty road between Arcata and Willow Creek. There was very little traffic, which was a good thing, because only occasionally was he driving in our traffic lane. pulling to a wide spot along the road.
Dave, I am a bit tired right now and I'm going to park right here. Let's get some sleep until morning.
The ground was very rocky and irregular, but we each had a blanket, so we crawled under the car and proceeded to sleep 15 minutes out of every uncomfortable hour. The space under the car was so low that a person could not turn over, so when I crawled in on my belly, I had to stay that way, with my face turned to the side to avoid the rocks and the dirt. The temperature had already dropped down into the 30s, and that thin wool army surplus blanket really did not do too much for my comfort. Ted's blanket was even worse, and the cold ground was sapping the warmth right out of us. About 5:30 a.m., without much sleep, we crawled back into the car. He started it up, and we went the rest of the way to Willow Creek, where nothing was open. Ted parked across the street from a coffee shop with a closed sign hanging in the window of the glass door. A light was on in the kitchen, way in the back. We sat and waited in the car, occasionally running the engine for heat. Ted hunted the dial for a radio station, getting a few squealing stations before settling in on KGO and a rebroadcast of Paul Harvey.
And now, the rest of the story.
So we sat in the car listening to the radio until about 7 a.m. when all the lights came on in the coffee shop and the door was unlocked. We both went in, sat down, and ordered coffee and pancakes. After we both ate and warmed up, and the bill was settled, we got in the car and backtracked a few miles down the road from Willow Creek to the stream where we were going to fish. I had a headache and was shaking so badly that I could hardly rig up my line. The cold was still bad, with frost on the ground anywhere there wasn't a tree. But somehow we stood out there and fished long enough to catch a couple of nice trout. I had only vomited once and was starting to have a little enthusiasm for this venture, but I needed a beer. Hair of the dog.
Let's jump in the car and go up to 4 Mile Creek. There are usually a lot of trout on that creek, but there are some hardcore pot growers up there, and I hear they are very protective of their gardens, even this early in the year.
I had no better idea, and he knew this area a lot better than I did. So we went up to that area, but found that all the best access points to the creek were occupied by trailers and shacks, and we couldn't get to the river. So Ted decided that it was best to go back to Willow Creek for fuel before driving around anymore. Heading north on Highway 96 towards the Hoopa Reservation, there were several spots where we stopped to throw our lines into the Trinity River. We even caught a few nice trout. At a grocery store on Hoopa, none of the clerks or patrons had a smile for us. We bought some beer, finally, and a couple of cans of Sterno. Then drove on until we were outside the reservation boundary. Finding a side road just off the highway, we then filleted our fish, sprinkled them with salt and pepper, and cooked them on sticks right over the Sterno flame. This tastes pretty fair. It must have been much better than that dead raw fish you found at the ocean at Fort Bragg.
I could tell it had been dead for less than a day. The gulls had hardly touched it when I found it.
No one believed you would live through eating that fish. That was pretty disgusting. I remembered looking at it and thinking it was in much worse shape than he was now claiming. It was definitely disgusting. After our lunch, we gathered up the empty cans and set them out in a row with a large cut bank backdrop behind them. Then Ted showed me the holster hidden under the front passenger seat. He removed a very nice Colt Woodsman 22 pistol. I remembered my Uncle Adolf had one in good condition, and Adolf let me shoot it several times. The one that Ted had was in like new condition, and we proceeded to shoot at the cans for about 25 shots each. I was not a really good shot with a pistol, but had had plenty of experience with firearms, so I could get by. When we finished cleaning up the cans, we jumped in the car and drove up to an old Yurok village called Wichipek, and we looked at the confluence of the beautiful Trinity River with the powerful Klamath River. The Trinity was running clear and relatively smooth, while the Klamath was murky and turbulent at this point. Then we pushed on, driving along the Klamath to the small town of Orleans. I guess there were about 200 to 300 people living there, a couple of stores and cafes and several bars. We walked around with a steady background noise of the river entertaining us while we looked at the sights, such as they were. Ted had been here many times, having grown up in Sawyer's Bar, and he had few good things to say about the area.
Let's push on, stop briefly at Ishi Pishi, then try our luck at fishing at Willow Creek.
I didn't know anything about Ishi Pishi or Willow Creek, so it all sounded good to me. We drove a few miles and stopped.
This is Bluff Creek. This is where the Hollywood guys are hanging around looking for and wanting to get a film of Bigfoot. I have talked to several of the people that met them, and one of them claims he was actually hired for $500 by Todd and Bunt to play Bigfoot, dressed in a gorilla costume supplied by this Hollywood guy. That may be, but the stories of sighting Bigfoot here go back a long time, hundreds of years, to the Hoopa, Klamath, and Yurok Indians. This used to be a real good stream to fish, but now it is heavily traveled and fished by tourists hoping to see the big guy. I understand that some of the lookers are carrying rifles, supposedly for protection, but the first person to show up with a Bigfoot, either alive or dead, will be famous. So we'll pass on this place and not get shot by mistake or otherwise.
We went on to Ishi Pishi. We parked the car about a quarter mile away and walked down an old road, then several hundred feet on a trail. The noise level from the Klamath River went way up as we approached. There were about 10 Indians hanging around the area, frowning at us as we approached, but they didn't say anything or impede our progress in any way. I thought there had probably been incidents of harassment before, and the local law enforcement had told them to cool it. This stretch of the river was sometimes called Ishi Pishi Falls, but it was not really a falls, just a steeper area in the river with a large number of rocks in the flow, disrupting the current and creating large standing waves and hydraulic jumps, as we would call them in engineering class. It was also a historic spot in local Indian culture, a place where their ancestors fished for the large salmon that went up this mighty river. To them, it was a sacred spot, and they would have liked to have seen it declared off limits to all except the tribes. But it wasn't. Not in 1963, anyway. Ted was uncharacteristically quiet and subdued while we were there, and I wondered why. From Ishi Pishi, we drove back to Soames Bar, then turned east and drove up the Salmon River a few miles to Willow Creek. Willow Creek entered the Salmon River on the north side of the river, and we were on the south side. It was one of the principal entrances into the Klamath Wilderness area, and if there really was a Bigfoot, it would be living in that rough terrain. There was a 2-inch thick cable connecting the two sides of the Salmon River with a steel car running on the cable. The idea was to get on the movable platform, sit down, grab the cable with both hands, and then working hand over hand, propel yourself across. It was about 200 feet across, and the cable had a large sag. So the first half of the trip was all downhill, but then the last half was all uphill, and it was a significant effort. But we made it across, got out, took the trail upstream several hundred feet, and proceeded to fish. But by then, it was late in the day, and we were tired out by all the drinking, lack of sleep, and other discomforts. We made our way back across to the Volvo without catching any fish there, and Ted convinced me that we should go back downstream to Orleans for supper. Then tomorrow morning, we would go back and really fish Willow Creek. Orleans was not large. I had estimated perhaps 200 people, but it was the largest settlement we had seen since we left Hoopa. We found a cafe that fed us a reasonable meal at a fair price. After dinner, we decided that it was too early to go to sleep, so we went into a bar just down the street. We sat at the bar, each ordered a beer, and commenced to drink.
There are the two white eyes that bothered our ancestors at Ishi Pishi.
We looked over, and there were 4 Hoopa or Karuk guys sitting nearby. They were looking at us without any smiles on their faces. They were all in their late 20s or early 30s, and dressed in boots, jeans, and plaid shirts. The one talking had several crudely done tattoos on his lower arms. I didn't recognize any of them, but apparently Ted did.
Yes, we were there this afternoon, and we're paying homage to your ancestors and their great spirits.
Ted said this without a trace of cockiness in his voice. I was astounded. It sounded rehearsed, part of a ritual. But this explanation didn't placate any of these guys. I saw no smiles.
If you were truly honoring their memories and greatness, you would have stayed away because their spirits do not like to be disturbed by the likes of you. I think I recognize you as someone from upriver who has been warned off before and has not yet learned his lesson.
It is true that I have been there before, but I wanted to show my friend the sight of the power of this river and let him imagine the daring your ancestors had to fish at this dangerous spot.
Ted said this with sincerity, but not apology. But this was not enough, and 2 of the men advanced on us using degrading words that everyone knew would end in a fight, 4 against 2. However, just then, the bartender shouted out,
"Start trouble in here again, Red Elk, and you'll be banned permanently from this saloon, and I will spread the word to the rest of the businesses, and your name will be shit in this town."
This ultimatum from the bartender stopped the pending violence right in its tracks. This is not to say that everyone or anyone was happy, ready to shake hands and sit down and share life stories. In fact, the next comment from Red Elk was an angry,
I cannot stay here and share space with these white dogs. We will leave this stinking bar and find better company.
He then walked out with his 3 buddies and slammed the door as loud as possible. Well, that got a little ugly.
There is a certain segment in Indian society that is bitter about the takeover of so much of their ancestral land, and they want to take it out on us. These men are all out of work and are using their unemployment checks to support their drinking habit.
The bartender appeared to be of mixed ancestry. It might not have been Hoopa or Karuk Indian, but possibly from one of the other tribes that had been forced onto the reservation by the U.S. Army in the 1800s. The government, not knowing or caring that those different tribes had been enemies for hundreds of years and might not ever get along, except to unite against any and all outsiders. We stayed at the bar talking to the bartender through several more beers. No new patrons came in, and it was late enough now to find another place to sleep. We thanked the bartender for averting an incident. We again jumped into the Volvo and headed upriver with no specific place to camp in mind. We drove for 5 or more miles on this rocky and narrow highway which hadn't been paved yet, and finally came to a lonely stretch that was several hundred feet above the river, and where the road narrowed down to 1 lane. The river was far below on our left, and a sheer rock cut on our right. We rounded a sharp turn, and there was an old van sideways across the road, effectively blocking it. The van's lights were not on, but we could see with our headlights there were 2 people sitting in the front. We stopped about 50 feet from the van, leaving our engine running. The van turned on its lights. 2 of the men we had met in the bar earlier that night then got out of the van. Ted said,
This looks like trouble. Get the pistol and let's get out of the car.
I grabbed the pistol from under the seat and stuck it out of sight under my shirt as I got out. Our new acquaintance, Red Elk, was the first to speak.
After 10 p.m., this highway becomes a toll road to all white eyes. We demand $20 toll before you can pass. If you will not pay, we will take it out of your hide.
In the headlights, it was plain that Red Elk had a large skinning knife on his belt. He gestured to it as he talked. The other Hoopa had a revolver in his hand. We were not getting past them without paying up or encountering violence. That was very clear.
A $20 bill to pass seems like a very high price for this stretch of road. What if I had a $5 bill to donate to your drinking fund?
No. You are known to me as a person that does not respect the rights of our tribe to this land and our paths through it. For you, the price is $20, and you are to never use this road again.
He stepped forward and put his hand on the knife.
No more negotiation. It is cold here and time to get this over with.
Very well. I will get my wallet out of the car.
Ted took several steps back to the car, reached in, and came out with a baseball bat in his hand. Red Elk pulled his knife out, raised the knife into a striking position, and took a quick step toward Ted, who then swung the bat and hit him hard on the side of the head. Red Elk grunted and fell at Ted's feet. The other guy immediately raised his pistol and took a shot at Ted, but missed. Ted ducked behind the car, so he started to swing the pistol toward me. He fired twice before I pulled my pistol from the waistband. I pulled back the hammer and pulled the trigger. There was a click, but no shot. I groaned, lowered the pistol, worked the slide to put a round in the chamber, and aimed again. He shot again, so I squeezed off 2 shots. One of the bullets struck him around the stomach. He bent forward with a cry and stood there bent over. Ted emerged from behind the car, ran over, and delivered 2 vicious blows to his head with the bat. In the space of a few seconds, we had 2 dead men in the road. Blood and brains were leaking out of the head of the second guy. I thought I was going to throw up, but I got myself under control. Standing there in the headlights, I looked over at Ted, who was leaning on his bat for support, and looked ill. We had 2 dead bodies in the middle of the highway. Now what were we going to do? Ted came out of his trance and said,
Let's check their car. There might be someone else inside.
It was a real mess inside, with beer cans, clothes, blankets, and other assorted junk. But no more people.
This toll road business has been used around here for years by different members of the tribe. Tonight, it did not turn out very well.
Ted had created a masterpiece of understatement. What are we going to do now? I asked. I suppose we need to go back to Orleans or wherever and call the sheriff.
I don't think that's a very good idea. You realize that law enforcement out here is done by members of the tribes, and that these men have relatives, lots of relatives, that believe that revenge and grudges should last forever. There is a small chance we can get clear of this by putting these drunks back in the van and pushing it over the cliff into the river. If the engine is running and it is in gear when it goes over, it might even catch fire and explode. If it doesn't, chances are good that it will wash downstream and not be found for days or even weeks, and we could be clear of the whole mess.
I was starting to have a physical reaction to this whole terrible mess, shaking and wanting to be sick. But I was thinking clearly enough to realize evidence of this incident plainly existed right now with tire tracks, blood, and empty bullet casings from the automatic in the road. If we pushed or drove the van over the bluff, there would be tracks on the berm at the edge. Further evidence, relatively easy to see. So any suspicion of foul play would soon enough be focused on two strangers whose identity could probably be traced back to us. But Ted was right in saying that once we were identified, we would be targets forever. So we really had two bad choices. Take our chances with justice in a region where the concept of justice was skewed, or try to conceal the whole thing. Over the next 15 minutes, we wrestled the heavy bodies back into the van, started the van, saturated some dirty clothes that were inside with gas, put it in gear, and let it roll over the edge. The bluff below the road was not completely vertical, so it hit rock outcroppings several times on its descent to the river. There was no explosion or anything real dramatic during its fall to the river. We could not see if it went in the river or was on the bank, but we did see some headlights coming up a number of turns back. So we jumped in the Volvo, turned off our headlights, and left the area. We drove about 10 miles up the Salmon River to a secluded spot, got out, and spread our blankets for the night. I didn't know about Ted, but I replayed the incident in my mind over and over until morning. Unless we had very good luck, the van would be found. The law enforcement officers would follow clues that we had sprinkled all over the landscape, and we would be in very deep trouble. I knew the shooting took place somewhere in the vicinity of Humboldt, Siskiyou, and Del Norte counties, but which one were we in? I hoped that it was Siskiyou or Del Norte, because they were poorer counties and might not do as good a job of investigating as Humboldt, which was where the Hoopa reservation was located, with all of the relatives pushing for action. Not being able to sleep, I went over the entire incident. We had been spotted by 2 to 4 natives visiting Ishi Pishi, and I thought we had acted respectful in the concept of visiting a sacred spot. But apparently, Ted had been there before, probably several times, and his presence or actions in the past had set some observers on edge. Then, we went into what I believed might have been the only bar in town where these observers had been drinking and seemed to be drunk and spoiling for a fight. We were not looking for trouble, but these people wanted trouble, and it was better to fight with strangers than with friends. I had seen this in my little hometown where people got a hair up their butts and just had to fight. And if no one else was around, they would fight with their own friends, and everything would be forgiven in the morning. But last night, they were kicked out of the bar before they had their satisfaction of beating us up and wrecking the bar. They went outside, probably talked it over, and decided to lay for us somewhere where they could beat the crap out of us. There were only 2 ways out of town, upstream or downstream. These guys picked upstream, which might have been luck, or it might have been because they were sure Ted was from a settlement upstream. 2 of the 4 probably waited downstream for us. There was going to be no getting out of there without a fight. They were ready for us with a gun and a knife. Paying the toll was probably not going to save us from a physical beating. They wanted to leave us bloody and battered on the side of the road, and who knows what else they had in mind. So in my mind, everything that had come to pass at that place was justified, and I had no sympathy for them. They got what they deserved. I was sure that our lives were ruined now. Nothing would ever be the same for us, or our families. We were as good as dead ourselves. Morning finally came. After breakfast of a candy bar and a bottle of Coke, we motored on up to Ted's family home at Sawyer's Bar. On the way up, we talked about the incident of the previous night and our actions to try to cover up what had happened. We both concluded that if we had just gone to the sheriff, we were likely to get off with a plea of self-defense. But now we might be charged with murder. But we had no money for an attorney, and neither did our families. So we would be at the mercy of a public defender of unknown competence. So who knows what might have been the result. Ted, that one big Indian, Red Elk, he acted like he knew you. Did you know him too?
Well, I have traveled up and down that stretch of the river many times, but I can't say I ever met him or knew him.
I thought about the words he used, particularly, I can't say. Ted was very intelligent, and those words could have several meanings, including, he did know the Indian, but he would not admit to it. I could see that further questioning was not going to lead anywhere, so I dropped my cross-examination. We reached Sawyer's Bar, a settlement of about a dozen little old houses, some of which appeared to be empty. There was a small store and a U.S. Forest Service office, both of which were closed this early in the morning. We went into his family house, and I met Ted's father, Vern, who was getting ready to go to work at the Forest Service office. He had many responsibilities there, including maintaining all the vehicles and other equipment used at their little field office. He also maintained the Pelton wheel generator that supplied electricity to the whole town of about 30 people. When Ted's mother, Rose, which was short for Desert Rose, came out of the kitchen, I got a shock. She was tall, slim, and very attractive, and obviously of Indian heritage, but probably not the local tribes. So Ted had Indian blood in him. This explained a lot of things to me. I had met his aunt and cousin in Fortuna, and they were of Portuguese and French lineage, and Ted talked a lot about them and visited them every week. But Ted never talked much about his father and mother. His father was probably not Indian, but his mother was, and I suddenly realized Ted did not want any of his friends at college to know that. He feared it would downgrade him in the eyes of others somehow. I thought back to several of the incidents of the last 2 days and how he had been subdued, almost meek, around a sacred site, and how he had almost apologized to Red Elk in the bar. Ted really did want to honor the native ancestors and how they had lived, but he couldn't admit it openly without losing face. If this little secret had been known by the Hoopa guys we encountered, none of this mess might have unfolded the way it did. But then again, it might not have changed anything. That was just speculation, of course, and it didn't seem to be too important to speculate endlessly about something that could not be resolved. We walked into the little house without knocking. The outside of the house might not have ever been painted, but the inside was much different. There were nice rugs on the pine floors. The rough wallboards were painted soft colors. Original paintings covered every wall. The furniture was in good condition. Lots of books and even sculptures were nicely arranged in every room I could see from the entry. Upon hearing us come in, Ted's father and mother came out of the kitchen and looked us over.
Well, Ted, long time no see.
Rose said nothing, just looked at us both with a gaze that said she expected trouble to come boiling out of our mouths.
This is my roommate, Dave,
said Ted.
We had a bit of trouble on the way up here and we're looking for advice.
Vern looked at Ted and said,
Ted, you haven't asked for my advice since you were 11. You must have some powerful problems coming to us so early in the day.
Well, that's right, Vern. On the way up here, we had to kill 2 Indians, and were wondering how we were going to get clear of this problem.
Vern must have thought Ted was joking.
I told you long ago to never kill an Indian up here until after you yourself were dead.
Rose spoke up.
Vern, shut up and listen for a change. Ted is serious about this and needs our help.
So Ted proceeded to give a 10-minute summary of the previous day's events. Questions were asked and answered. Vern summed it all up by saying,
And if it were me, I would head out for Mexico right away and look to start a new life down there. If you stick around here, you might possibly get free of a murder conviction, but you will get at least 5 years in prison, and the relatives of the dead Indians are going to be waiting for you when you get out.
Rose concurred that Vern was giving good advice to a son that had never taken anyone's advice. Vern continued by saying that everyone in this little village would know by now that Ted and his college friend were here in town, and that word would be passed up and down the river by way of a private, free, primitive telephone system that connected everyone together when the law was in the area or some other event of note was happening. So within an hour of arriving at Sawyer's Bar, we were out of there. We went east from Sawyer's Bar over the mountain pass, dropped down to Etna, then motored south on Forest Highway 3 through Trinity Center to Weaverville, then west on Highway 299 until we reached Arcata. On the way home, I was able to get Ted to talk about his family, which passed the time, because this was one of the longest drives of my life. Afterward. Back in Arcata, I gave some real serious thought to heading to Mexico. But I thought I was so close to the end of the semester that I'd take my chances. I resumed my life, going to Humboldt State full-time and working for the state parks as an engineering aide part-time. I had always been good about going to classes, but not too good about studying. Now I started to study and do homework. But every hour or so I would replay the incident, as it was called in my mind. I never told my family anything about it, but when I came home, they could sense that I was troubled. So I stopped going home. It was much the same with my girlfriend. She wanted to know what was going on in my head, and I couldn't talk to her about it. I couldn't talk to anyone about it, except Ted. After a week or two of that, it was over between us. I rationalized that I didn't really like her anyway. During our last evening together, she informed me that she would be going to Sacramento State College to finish her degree. Ted moved out of the apartment and went to live with his grandmother in Fortuna. He had never been good about attending classes, but he made passing grades on his tests. Now, though, he didn't show up for classes or tests. I saw him once or twice. It appeared that his drinking had increased and his sleeping had decreased. A few weeks after he moved out, he didn't come around anymore. I called his grandmother to ask if he was going to come back and get his belongings.
Well, Ted packed one of my old suitcases last week, kissed me goodbye, and I haven't seen or heard of him since. What things of his I didn't want I donated to the Salvation Army?
Every night, I tossed and turned in the bed, and when I would fall asleep, I had nightmares. The shooting nightmare was easy to figure, and I had that every night. But then I started having one about falling, where you fall and fall, building up incredible speed, but you never reach the bottom. I had heard some amateur psychologists say that if you reached the bottom, you would die of fright or something. But how did she know? I started drinking a bit after work, and one Friday night in August, I went down to Eureka. 2nd Street was the place to go. It was filled with old bars, hotels, second-hand stores, and the like. It was frequented by loggers, commercial fishermen, hippies, and college kids like me who would go. Several of the bars had live music on the weekends. The music was loud, and the drinking was heavy. I found a place I liked, went in, and sat at the bar. I was on my stool looking at the bottles stacked in front of the big mirror behind the bar, when through the mirror's reflection, I saw 3 young women come in. I turned around to look and recognized 2 of them as college girls that I had met before. One of them, Laura was her name, was tall and slim with a nice smile. They sat down at a table, and I wasted no time going over to their table, reintroducing myself, and buying the first round of several. I danced with all 3 of them, as did some other men that were there, but I only danced the slow dances with Laura. After a couple of dances, we were starting to come to a mutual understanding about the rest of the evening when the barroom door opened and 2 young Indians came in. I was looking over Laura's shoulder. We were dancing cheek to cheek, and I got a cold shock when I saw them. They were the 2 Indians that had been with Red Elk in the bar the night of the incident. The 2 that had not been there on the road to work us over. It was late, and they were already staggering when they came in and talking loudly. I kept Laura moving, so she partially shielded me with her body from their view until they were past. It was time to make a move. I suggested right then and there that Laura and I should go to my place for a nightcap. She agreed, waved goodbye to her friends, and we walked out arm in arm. I was sweating freely from more than the dancing, and my mind was whirring with questions. First, was it really the same men? I had only seen them for a few minutes in Orleans, so I could be mistaken about their identity. No, it was the same men. Second, these men were more than 100 miles from home. Were they here looking for me and Ted, or was it just an accidental crossing? No, it was not an accident. I didn't believe in accidents. Third, where did they get the idea Ted and I might be in the Eureka area? Fourth, were they alone, or were there others out there looking for us? This was speculation, but there were probably other friends and relatives out there armed with at least Ted's name that were looking for us. I took her home after a late breakfast, and we agreed to meet again soon. But after I dropped her off, I headed for the Bucksport sporting goods store, where I shopped for a pistol. I found a nice .32 caliber automatic that was about a half-inch thick and smaller than my hand. It held 5 shots in the clip, plus 1 in the barrel, and would fit in my front pocket. I bought the gun and a box of 50 cartridges and found a secluded spot down by the mouth of the Eel River to do a little target practicing with my new weapon. I vowed then that I would carry it at all times. Summer was coming to an end. I moved out of the apartment in Arcata into a smaller one in Eureka, about a mile from my office. I didn't tell any of the neighbors or friends my new address, and I gave the old landlord a fake new address. But I did supply the post office with my correct new address. And one afternoon, I got a forwarded letter from my draft board in Mendocino County. They reminded me that I was 1A, at the top of the list for the draft, and that if I wanted to continue my student deferment, I needed to enroll as a full-time college student and have the school send the registration information along to the draft board. I was really thinking every day about leaving the area, probably heading for Mexico. But I decided that in a few weeks, I would register for classes, then leave immediately. This would keep the draft board off my back for a semester. Then they would probably send me letters for several more months before they contacted the FBI with news that I had skipped out. About a week before registration, I came home from work all hot and sweaty from a hard day in the field. After my shower, there was a knock on the door. I opened the door, and there were 2 deputies from the Humboldt County Sheriff Department there. My heart dropped to my feet.
Hello, I'm Sergeant York, and this is Officer Moore. I'm looking for David Bowman.
You found him.
I'm also looking for Ted Thorne. Is he around?
No, I haven't seen Ted in several months, and he doesn't live here.
Mr. Bowman, I would like to talk to you about an incident that happened in Humboldt County this last April. Your name has come up in connection with it. Can we come in?
Sure, come on in. I would like to get dressed before we talk. They followed me inside the small apartment. I walked into the bedroom where my dirty clothes were, went to the dresser, and started taking out clean clothes. I put on clean jeans and shirt, then reached into the pocket of my dirty clothes and started taking out my wallet. Then my hands went into the other front pocket and started taking out the pistol. When it was fully in my hand, I turned around, but the sergeant already had his pistol in his hand, and when I raised my arm with the pistol, he fired. I shot also, but he fired twice more, and all 3 shots, fired at a range of 6 feet, hit me hard and knocked me down. The pain was incredible for a few seconds, but it didn't last. It was replaced by a dull ache, and my eyes would not focus any longer. Then, all was black.
In a late afternoon confrontation yesterday, David Bowman, a suspect in a dual homicide incident last spring in eastern Humboldt County, shot it out with sheriff's deputies and lost the contest. The incident took place at 3348 Park Street in Eureka and had the neighborhood in an uproar with the sirens, ambulances, and crime scene tape upsetting a normally quiet area. The sheriff officers, Sergeant Richard York and Officer Roger Moore, had been investigating what has been described as a hate crime against Native Americans since the brutal slaying, and they had finally found one of the 2 suspects hiding out in this quiet neighborhood. Bowman, a part-time employee of the state park system, had moved there just a few weeks before and was not known by any of the other residents. Sheriff's records indicate that just after Easter this year, Bowman and his companion Theodore Thorne had been drinking heavily at a bar in Orleans. They had been loud, obnoxious to other patrons, and had made insulting racial remarks to many of the clients. The bartender had finally forced them out, but they stayed around outside, apparently looking for trouble. When James Hunt and Fred Fisher, both former outstanding athletes at Hoopa High, left the bar, Poole and Thorne confronted them with more insults and slurs. Hoping to avoid trouble, Hunt and Fisher left and started east, but Thorne and Bowman were soon following them in their powerful sports car. Evidence indicates Thorne forced the Hunt car to stop on a deserted stretch of road, where Thorne and Bowman brutally attacked the unarmed men with guns and clubs, killing them in the road, then placing their bodies back in the car and driving it over a cliff into the Klamath River.